While kings built their legacies with swords and armies, I discovered three queens who built theirs with something far more dangerous: their minds. And what I found in the historical records will completely change how you think about female power. You think male rulers were ruthless? Let me tell you about Wu Zetian, a peasant's daughter who didn't just become Empress of China. She literally invented the title emperor for herself and ruled the world's largest empire for 15 years. While male emperors relied on generals and violence, she created the world's first secret police network and turned information into her weapon of choice. Or how about Catherine de Medici, who didn't need to wear a crown to control France for 30 years? While kings fought wars that lasted months, she orchestrated political strategies that lasted decades. She managed to keep 3 of her sons on the throne while being the real power behind every single decision. Talk about playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. And then there's Isabella of Castile, who took a fractured kingdom that everyone said could never be unified and turned it into the most powerful empire on earth. While her male contemporaries were busy fighting each other, she was quietly funding a guy named Christopher Columbus and claiming an entire new world for Spain. Here's what absolutely blows my mind about these women. They didn't just succeed in a man's world, they completely redefined what power looked like. Kings throughout history relied on brute force and intimidation. These queens? They used psychology, strategic thinking, and pure political genius to achieve things that male rulers could only dream of. Can you imagine being so strategically brilliant that you convince an entire empire to change a 1,000-year-old rule about women ruling? That's exactly what Wu Zetian did. Picture being so politically savvy that you manipulate 3 different kings while they think they're in charge. That was Catherine de Medici's daily reality. If queens who outsmarted entire kingdoms fascinate you as much as they fascinate me, stick around, because today you're going to discover political strategies that were so effective. They're still studied by world leaders today. Please subscribe to the channel, because these stories will prove that when it comes to truly ruthless leadership, these women wrote the playbook that everyone else is still trying to follow. What makes these queens even more incredible is that they had to be twice as strategic as any man just to survive, let alone thrive. They couldn't rely on traditional power structures, so they created entirely new ones. They couldn't use physical intimidation, so they mastered psychological warfare instead. And here's the kicker. While history books love to focus on male conquerors who left behind ruins and ashes, these 3 queens left behind empires, innovations, and political systems that lasted for centuries. That's not just ruthless, that's genius-level ruthless. But the story of how a peasant girl convinced China to crown her emperor, that's where things get absolutely insane. So, let's start with Wu Zetian, because her story is so unbelievable that if you saw it in a movie, you'd think Hollywood was being ridiculous. We're talking about a girl born to a peasant family in 624 AD, who somehow convinced the most powerful empire on earth to make her their emperor. Not empress, emperor. She literally forced them to invent a new title because the existing one wasn't powerful enough. Here's how insanely strategic this woman was from day one. At 14 years old, she enters the imperial palace as a low-ranking concubine. Now, most people in her position would try to catch the emperor's attention through beauty or charm. Wu Zetian, she immediately started studying. While other concubines were learning dance and music, she was mastering calligraphy, literature, and most importantly, politics. She realized something that nobody else understood. Information was more valuable than beauty in the imperial court. So instead of competing with hundreds of other women for the emperor's affections, she made herself indispensable as an advisor. Think about how brilliant this is. While everyone else was trying to be noticed, she was making herself necessary. But here's where it gets absolutely wild. When Emperor Taizong died, all his concubines were supposed to become nuns for the rest of their lives. That was the rule. no exceptions. Wu Zetian looked at this rule and basically said, "Not happening." She had already been secretly building relationships with the new emperor, Gaozong, while his father was still alive. Can you imagine the level of strategic thinking this required? She's essentially playing a political game where one wrong move means death or permanent exile, and she's planning 3 moves ahead while everyone else is just trying to survive day by day. Within 2 years of the old emperor's death, she had convinced Gaozong not only to bring her back to the palace but to make her his second highest concubine. But Wu Zetian wasn't satisfied with being second to anyone. She studied the existing empress and identified every single political weakness she had. The current empress, Wang, had been playing palace politics the old-fashioned way, through family connections and traditional influence. Wu Zetian realized that in a changing world, traditional methods weren't enough anymore. She needed to create an entirely new playbook. So she started building what would become the most sophisticated intelligence network in Chinese history. She recruited servants, guards, ministers, and even members of the royal family to feed her information about everything happening in the palace. While Empress Wang was focused on court ceremonies and traditional duties, Wu Zetian was creating a web of loyalty that reached into every corner of the empire. The most incredible part? She did all of this while pretending to be a humble, obedient concubine. She understood that power isn't about what people see. It's about what people don't see. But what she did next to secure her position as the only woman who mattered in the emperor's life. That move was so calculated and brilliant that it changed the entire course of Chinese history. What Wu Zetian did next was political genius on a level that makes modern politicians look like amateurs. She realized that to become empress, she couldn't just defeat Empress Wang, she had to make the emperor believe that removing Wang was his own idea. So she started what I can only describe as the most sophisticated psychological campaign in ancient history. Instead of attacking Empress Wang directly, Wu Zetian began positioning herself as the solution to problems that Wang couldn't solve. When the emperor struggled with administrative decisions, Wu Zetian had answers. When he needed advice on military strategy, she had studied the general's reports. When he wanted to discuss philosophy and literature, she could quote classical texts from memory. But here's the masterstroke that absolutely blows my mind. Wu Zetian convinced the emperor that she was his intellectual equal, not just his romantic partner. Think about how revolutionary this was in 650 AD China. Women weren't supposed to understand politics, military strategy, or governance. Wu Zetian made herself indispensable by proving she understood these things better than most of his male advisors. Within 3 years, she had completely replaced Empress Wang in the emperor's mind. But getting the title wasn't enough for Wu Zetian. She understood that real power meant controlling information. So she created what historians now call the first organized intelligence service in Chinese history. She recruited informants from every level of society. Palace servants who overheard conversations, merchants who traveled between cities, government officials who needed her favor, even members of noble families who wanted access to the emperor. This wasn't just palace gossip. This was systematic intelligence gathering that would make modern spy agencies jealous. The most incredible part? She used this information network not just to protect herself, but to actually improve how the empire was run. When she discovered corruption in distant provinces, she would subtly guide the emperor toward discovering it himself. When she learned about potential rebellions, she would position loyal governors in those areas before problems could develop. Can you imagine being so strategically brilliant that you turn information gathering into a tool for better governance? While most rulers throughout history used spies to eliminate enemies, Wu Zetian used hers to create a more efficient empire. By 655 AD, she had achieved what seemed impossible. She convinced Emperor Gaozong to make her his empress, removing Wang from power entirely. But Wu Zetian wasn't satisfied with being empress. She had already figured out that the real power behind the throne could be more valuable than the throne itself. When the emperor started having health problems, Wu Zetian gradually began making more and more governmental decisions. She didn't stage a coup or demand recognition. She simply became so competent at ruling that everyone started coming to her for answers instead of him. But this was just the beginning of her master plan. What she did over the next 30 years would prove that when it comes to long-term strategic thinking, she was playing a completely different game than everyone else. Now let's talk about Catherine de Medici, because if Wu Zetian was a master of information, Catherine was a master of people. This woman spent 30 years controlling France without ever officially ruling it, and her story proves that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one nobody suspects. Picture this. It's 1533, and a 14-year-old Italian girl arrives in France for an arranged marriage. Everyone at the French court looks down on her because she's not from a royal bloodline. Her family made their fortune in banking, not birthright. The French nobles think she's beneath them. Her new husband barely pays attention to her, and for the first 10 years of her marriage, she can't even produce an heir. Most people in Catherine's position would have faded into irrelevance. Catherine de Medici. She used those 10 years to study every single person at the French court. While everyone was ignoring her, she was learning their secrets, their ambitions, their fears, and most importantly, their weaknesses. Here's what makes Catherine absolutely fascinating as a political strategist. She realized that in a world where men held all the official power, the real influence came from understanding what those men actually wanted. So instead of trying to compete with them directly, she made herself the person who could deliver what they needed. When her husband finally became King Henry II, Catherine had already built relationships with every important noble family in France. She knew who was in debt, who was having affairs, who had ambitions for higher positions, and who could be trusted with sensitive information. Essentially, she had created a human database of the entire French aristocracy. But the moment that changed everything was when King Henry died in a jousting accident in 1559. Suddenly, Catherine's 15-year-old son Francis became king, and everyone expected her to step back and let the male nobles run the government. Instead, Catherine stepped forward and basically announced that she would be making the real decisions. Guys, if you're loving this journey through royal women who redefined power, please subscribe to the channel, because what I'm about to tell you next is going to blow your mind about how one woman managed to control an entire kingdom for 3 decades. The genius of Catherine's approach was that she never tried to be queen in her own right. Instead, she positioned herself as the indispensable advisor to her sons. When Francis died after just 1 year and her 10-year-old son Charles became king, she didn't fight the nobles who wanted to control him. She made them need her to control him. Think about how brilliant this strategy was. She understood that men would never accept a woman as their official leader, but they would accept a woman as the bridge between them and their child king. She became the ultimate political translator, the person who could explain what a 10-year-old king really meant by his decisions. But Catherine's most shocking political strategy involved something that would make modern politicians absolutely lose their minds. Catherine de Medici's most shocking political strategy was something that would absolutely destroy a modern politician's career. She refused to pick a side in the biggest conflict of her time. France was literally tearing itself apart in religious wars between Catholics and Protestants, and while everyone expected her to choose one side and crush the other, Catherine did something completely different. She played both sides, and it was absolutely brilliant. Think about how insane this was in the 1560s. This was an era when religious wars were destroying entire countries across Europe. Kings were losing their thrones for supporting the wrong faith. Catherine looked at this chaos and decided that the real enemy wasn't Catholics or Protestants. It was the idea that France had to choose between them. So she created what historians call the politique strategy, essentially putting the stability of France above religious purity. When Catholic nobles demanded that she eliminate Protestant influences, she would remind them that Protestant regions contributed significant tax revenue. When Protestant leaders pushed for more religious freedom, she would point out that Catholic nobles controlled most of the military forces. Catherine understood something that most rulers never figured out. You can't govern people who are constantly trying to destroy each other. So instead of letting religious extremists on either side dictate policy, she made herself the indispensable mediator between them. But here's where Catherine's genius really shows. She didn't just balance religious factions, she used strategic marriages as diplomatic weapons. She had 7 children, and she turned each of their marriages into political masterstrokes that strengthened France's position across Europe. Her daughter Elizabeth married King Philip II of Spain, securing France's southern border. Her daughter Margot married Henry of Navarre, creating an alliance with Protestant nobles while keeping Catholic support. Her daughter Claude married the Duke of Lorraine, controlling France's eastern territories. Can you imagine orchestrating family relationships like chess, moves on a continental game board? The most incredible part of Catherine's strategy was her timing. She would arrange these marriages years in advance, sometimes when the children were still babies, because she could see political opportunities developing before anyone else noticed them. While other rulers were reacting to immediate crises, Catherine was positioning France for conflicts that hadn't even started yet. And she survived. For 30 years, Catherine de Medici managed to keep France united while Spain, England, and Germany were experiencing civil wars, religious persecutions, and political chaos. She outlasted 4 different kings, countless noble rebellions, and multiple foreign invasion attempts. When she finally died in 1589, France was stronger, more stable, and more influential than it had been when she started. That's not just political survival, that's political mastery. But if you think Catherine de Medici was impressive for controlling France behind the scenes, wait until you hear about Isabella of Castile, who didn't hide behind anyone. She took power directly and used it to create the largest empire in human history. Isabella of Castile makes Wu Zetian and Catherine de Medici look subtle, because this woman decided that playing behind the scenes wasn't enough. She was going to take power directly and reshape the entire world while she was at it. Here's what absolutely blows my mind about Isabella's story. In 1474, when the King of Castile died, the throne was supposed to go to his daughter Juana. But Isabella, who was the king's half-sister, looked at this situation and basically said, "Actually, I think I'll be queen instead." And then she convinced an entire kingdom that she was right. Think about how audacious this was. We're talking about medieval Spain, where women inheriting anything significant was controversial, let alone claiming a crown that legally belonged to someone else. Isabella didn't just break the rules, she rewrote them completely. But here's where Isabella proves she was a strategic genius, not just an ambitious princess. She realized that claiming a throne was one thing, but holding on to it required something much more sophisticated. She needed to make herself not just queen, but indispensable to the future of Spain. So at 18 years old, Isabella orchestrated what would become the most consequential marriage in European history. She secretly married Ferdinand of Aragon, uniting the 2 most powerful kingdoms in Spain without asking permission from any of the male nobles who thought they should control such decisions. Can you imagine the level of strategic thinking this required? She's essentially gambling her entire future on the idea that 2 kingdoms working together would be stronger than dozens of smaller territories fighting each other, and she was absolutely right. Within 5 years, Isabella and Ferdinand had created the most powerful unified state in Europe. But Isabella wasn't content with just being the most powerful queen in Europe. She wanted to be the most powerful ruler in the world, period. Here's what makes Isabella different from Wu Zetian and Catherine de Medici. Wu Zetian worked within existing systems and gradually changed them. Catherine operated behind the scenes, influencing without being seen. Isabella, she completely demolished existing power structures and rebuilt them according to her own vision. She took a collection of fractured Spanish territories that had been fighting each other for centuries and convinced them to work together toward common goals. She established a unified legal system, a central treasury, and most importantly, a shared sense of Spanish identity that had never existed before. But Isabella's most controversial and far-reaching decision involved a guy named Christopher Columbus and a completely insane proposal that every other European ruler had already rejected. What she decided to do with Columbus would prove that she wasn't just thinking about controlling Spain, she was planning to control the world. And the way she funded his expedition. That decision changed the course of human history and created an empire that would dominate global politics for the next 4 centuries. What Isabella did next proves that she wasn't just thinking about Spain, she was planning to dominate the entire planet. In 1492, Christopher Columbus came to her with a proposal that every other European ruler had already laughed out of their courts. He wanted to sail west to reach Asia, which everyone knew was impossible because the Earth was way too big, and he would die in the middle of the ocean. Isabella looked at this proposal and saw something that nobody else understood. Even if Columbus was wrong about reaching Asia, he might discover something else entirely. And if he did find new lands, Spain would own them. While other rulers were focused on fighting their neighbors for tiny pieces of European territory, Isabella was betting on the possibility of claiming entire continents that nobody even knew existed yet. Here's what absolutely amazes me about this decision. Isabella wasn't just gambling money. She was investing in a completely theoretical possibility that most educated people thought was ridiculous. But she understood something that made her different from every other ruler of her time. The biggest rewards come from taking risks that everyone else is too afraid to consider. When Columbus returned with news of lands across the ocean, Isabella immediately claimed everything he had discovered and everything he might discover in the future for Spain. Think about how audacious this was. She basically declared ownership of places she had never seen, couldn't locate on a map, and knew almost nothing about. But the genius of Isabella's strategy became clear over the next decade. While other European powers were still fighting over small territories in Europe, Spain was establishing colonies, trade routes, and resource extraction operations across an entire hemisphere. She had essentially given Spain a head start in global expansion that would last for centuries. Meanwhile, back in Spain, Isabella was implementing domestic policies that would make the unified Spanish state unstoppable. She established the Spanish Inquisition as a tool for political unity, standardized laws across all Spanish territories, and created a centralized government system that could efficiently manage both European territories and overseas colonies. Can you imagine coordinating an empire that stretched from Europe to the Americas using 15th century communication technology? Isabella created administrative systems that were so effective they served as the model for European colonial management for the next 300 years. The most incredible part of Isabella's legacy is the sheer scale of what she accomplished. By the time she died in 1504, Spain had become the first truly global empire in human history. Spanish influence extended across Europe, throughout the Americas, and into Asia and Africa. She had turned a collection of squabbling medieval kingdoms into the most powerful political force on Earth. But when you compare Isabella's direct approach to Wu Zetian's intelligence network and Catherine de Medici's behind-the-scenes manipulation, you start to see something absolutely fascinating about how these 3 women redefined what ruthless leadership actually means. When you look at Wu Zetian, Catherine de Medici, and Isabella of Castile side by side, something absolutely incredible becomes clear. These women weren't just more ruthless than male rulers, they were playing an entirely different game that was infinitely more sophisticated. Think about how traditional male rulers operated throughout history. They conquered territories through military force, maintained power through intimidation, and solved problems by eliminating opposition. It was effective in the short term, but it was also incredibly wasteful and unstable. Empires built on pure force tend to collapse the moment their founder dies. Wu Zetian completely revolutionized this approach. Instead of building power through fear, she built it through necessity. She made herself so valuable to the functioning of the Chinese Empire that removing her would have caused administrative chaos. While male emperors throughout Chinese history had to constantly worry about military coups and noble rebellions, Wu Zetian's reign was remarkably stable because she had created a system where everyone benefited from her being in charge. Catherine de Medici took a different approach, but achieved the same result. While male rulers of her era were destroying their kingdoms in religious wars, she figured out how to profit from both sides of the conflict. Think about how brilliant this was. Instead of trying to crush opposition, she made opposition work for her. The Protestant and Catholic nobles spent so much energy competing with each other that they never had enough left over to challenge her authority. Isabella of Castile shows us what happens when you combine traditional ruthlessness with visionary strategic thinking. Yes, she was absolutely willing to use force when necessary, but she understood that real power came from expansion, not just conquest. While other European rulers were fighting over the same territories their grandfathers had fought over, Isabella was claiming entire continents. Here's what makes all three of these women fundamentally different from their male contemporaries. They understood that sustainable power requires building systems, not just winning battles. Male rulers throughout history tended to focus on immediate victories and dramatic demonstrations of strength. These queens focused on creating political structures that would outlast them. The result? Wu Zetian's administrative innovations influenced Chinese governance for centuries. Catherine de Medici's diplomatic strategies became the foundation of modern European statecraft. Isabella's colonial systems dominated global politics for 400 years. But here's the most fascinating part of their success. They achieved all of this while operating under massive disadvantages that no male ruler ever had to face. They couldn't rely on traditional military support because armies were controlled by men who didn't trust female leadership. They couldn't use conventional political networks because those networks excluded women. They couldn't even display anger or aggression without being labeled as hysterical or unfit to rule. So they had to be smarter, more strategic, and more psychologically sophisticated than any man in their position would have needed to be. They turned every disadvantage into an advantage and every limitation into a strength. But here's what absolutely blows my mind about these three queens. Their innovations in political strategy are more relevant today than ever before. Here's what absolutely fascinates me about Wu Zetian, Catherine de Medici, and Isabella of Castile. If you study how successful leaders operate today, you'll realize they're still using strategies that these three queens invented over 500 years ago. Think about modern political leaders who build power through information networks instead of traditional hierarchies. That's Wu Zetian's playbook. She understood that in a complex world, the person with the best information makes the best decisions, and the person who makes the best decisions eventually gets the most power. Every successful modern politician, business leader, and social influencer is basically copying Wu Zetian's approach of turning knowledge into influence. Or look at leaders today who succeed by building coalitions instead of trying to dominate opposition. That's pure Catherine de Medici strategy. She figured out that it's more effective to manage competing interests than to eliminate them. Because when you eliminate opposition, you also eliminate valuable perspectives and resources. Modern diplomatic negotiations, corporate partnerships, and even successful social media influencers All use Catherine's approach of making different groups need each other instead of fighting each other. Isabella of Castile basically invented what we now call disruptive innovation. While everyone else was competing within existing markets, she created entirely new markets that didn't exist before. That's exactly what successful entrepreneurs do today. They don't try to be better than their competitors. They make their competitors irrelevant by changing the entire game. But here's what makes these queens even more relevant to modern leadership. They succeeded in environments where they had to be twice as strategic as their male competitors just to survive. That's still the reality for women in leadership today, and for anyone who's trying to succeed without traditional advantages like inherited wealth, family connections, or institutional support. Wu Zetian's strategy of making yourself indispensable is exactly what career advisors tell people today. Catherine's approach of building alliances across different groups is fundamental to modern networking and coalition building. Isabella's willingness to invest in unproven opportunities is basically the definition of successful entrepreneurship. Can you imagine how different world history would be if more leaders throughout the centuries had used strategic thinking instead of just brute force? These three queens prove that intelligence, patience, and psychological understanding are infinitely more powerful than intimidation and violence. The most incredible part is that their approaches are actually more effective now than they were in their own time. In our connected, information-rich world, Wu Zetian's intelligence-gathering strategies would be absolutely unstoppable. In our globalized economy, Catherine's coalition-building skills would make someone incredibly powerful. In our innovation-driven society, Isabella's willingness to bet on revolutionary ideas would create unimaginable wealth and influence. These weren't just three exceptional women who happened to be good at politics. These were three visionaries who fundamentally changed how power works, and were still living in the world they created. But when you really think about what made these queens more ruthless than any king, the truth is even more shocking than their individual accomplishments. So here's the shocking truth about what made Wu Zetian, Catherine de Medici, and Isabella of Castile more ruthless than any king in history. They had to be. And that necessity created a level of strategic brilliance that male rulers never had to develop. Think about it this way. When a king made a mistake, he could usually survive it through military force, family connections, or simply because people expected men to be in charge. When these queens made mistakes, they faced immediate removal, exile, or execution. They couldn't afford to be anything less than perfect at political strategy because there was no safety net beneath them. That pressure created something absolutely extraordinary. It forced them to develop political skills that were generations ahead of their time. Wu Zetian had to create entirely new systems for gathering intelligence and building loyalty, because traditional methods weren't available to her. Catherine de Medici had to master psychological manipulation and coalition building because she couldn't rely on military intimidation. Isabella of Castile had to become visionary in her strategic thinking because incremental improvements weren't enough to secure her position. The result? These women didn't just succeed despite the obstacles they faced. They succeeded because of them. Every limitation they encountered forced them to innovate. And every innovation made them more powerful than rulers who never had to think beyond traditional approaches. But here's what makes their legacy even more incredible. They proved that ruthless doesn't have to mean destructive. Traditional male rulers throughout history left behind a trail of wars, rebellions, and collapsed empires. Wu Zetian left behind administrative systems that improved Chinese governance for centuries. Catherine left behind diplomatic strategies that prevented France from destroying itself. Isabella left behind a global empire that dominated world politics for 400 years. They were more ruthless than any king because they understood something that most male rulers never figured out. Real ruthlessness means being so strategically superior that your enemies can't even comprehend the game you're playing. While kings were fighting battles, these queens were winning wars. While kings were conquering territories, these queens were reshaping civilizations. And in today's world, where information travels instantly, where building alliances is more valuable than building armies, and where innovation matters more than tradition, their approaches are more relevant than ever. Every successful female leader today, whether in politics, business, or any other field, is essentially using strategies that these three queens perfected centuries ago. So which of these three queens shocked you the most with her strategic brilliance? Comment below, because I read every single one. Was it Wu Zetian's transformation from peasant to emperor? Catherine's 30-year control of France from behind the scenes? Or Isabella's creation of the first global empire? And if you want more stories about historical figures who were more brilliant than anyone realized, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, because next week I'm bringing you 3 military commanders who make modern generals look like they're playing with toy soldiers. The truth is, when women had to fight for power, they became better at wielding it than anyone who simply inherited it.